Hey, it's Marcel. Before we kick off this episode, just a reminder that I have joined Substack, and one of the features of Substack may pique your interest. It's the green room. Let me explain. At the end of each episode now, we're going to continue the conversation in the green room over at Substack. The green room is where I ask my world-renowned guests questions you're not going to get anywhere else. And not just any questions, but topics that appeal to the everyday leader struggling to juggle priorities, motivate people, deal with conflict, etc. I'm going to put the link to my Substack in the show notes if you'd like to join us for more private conversation. So check it out after this episode. Click on the link, and we'll see you over there. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Love in Action Podcast, the show that explores all the ways you can evolve into the best version of yourself as a leader. I'm your host, executive coach, speaker, and author, Marcel Schwantes. I believe that when we show up with our full humanity to work and lead from a place of love and care and inclusion, it will make a radical difference in your leadership, your business, and your bottom line. This is a show about love as a leadership and business strategy. Let's do this. Hey, glad you could join us. Got a great show for you today. And I want to start with a question. And it's a really thought-provoking question. So here it is. Why is it that leaders often take the blame when their employees perform poorly, but not when they behave badly at work? I mean, it's almost like there's some kind of unwritten rule that protects leaders when their employees go off the rails, right? They act unprofessionally, they act unethically, they rebel against the organization or against their fellow coworkers, right? So what's going on here? I mean, you might think, I don't know, instinctually that this is because it's just not fair to, hold leaders accountable for the actions of that one bad apple in the bunch. So if you got the one rebel in the group that's wreaking havoc and disrupting the workplace, we don't blame the leader, or do we? Well, we got to look at the research. Okay, so recent research came across my desk that suggests that leaders are often one of the primary reasons for employees acting out or engaging in what they call, air quotes, deviant behavior. So what the researchers are suggesting here is that rather than relying on, the old bad apple theory to explain your employees' bad behavior, we should instead turn our focus to the leaders and what they may be doing to bring that out, those people who would otherwise, be good organizational citizens. So that's setting the table for you, because today we're going to be talking to those very distinguished scholars who did the research. And we're going to get down and dirty, folks, and ask the questions. So is it the bad apples or is it bad leaders? Now, normally I would introduce my guests and read off their bios, but we have three of them today. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, and they have joined us. And I'm going to ask you who you are, where you teach, and what's your area of research, your specialization. And I want to start with Charn. Kick us off.
Hey, thank you for the introduction to our research, Marcel. My name is Charn McAllister. I'm the W.A. Franke Professor of Management at Northern Arizona University. I also run our Institute for Public and Professional Ethics and Leadership. Bit of a mouthful to say. I focus my research mainly on interpersonal mistreatment, which this falls squarely within, and tangential to leadership, and then something we call political skill.
Very good. And by the way, folks, Charn is a repeat guest. He was here 3 years ago, I want to say, and we had a great chat back then. I'm going to put that episode as well in the show notes if you want to go and refer to it. And Katie, I'll go to you next.
Sure. I'm Katie Alexander. I'm an assistant professor of management at Loyola University Chicago. It's a Jesuit institution in Chicago, Illinois. And most of my research is in destructive leadership, so dark side of leadership and how that impacts the workplace, employees, as well as organizations.
I can start to see the dots connecting here as I hear about your areas of research focus. Okay. All right, Parker, go for it.
Yeah, Parker Ellen. I am the Tommy and Terry News Professor of Management at Mississippi State University. I'm also the Associate Dean for Research and Executive Programs. Very similarly, my research touches on primarily organizational politics, leadership, and interpersonal mistreatment.
Well, it is truly an honor to have you, all three of you together here. I just want to say it's because a lot of the information and research that informs my work and people like me that are out there in the front lines teaching, coaching leaders comes from people like you. So without you doing the research, we wouldn't carry much weight without the data backing up the evidence being there to support the practitioners out in the front line. So thank you. Thank you. Okay, gang. So I thought we would start with sort of a backdrop. I don't know. There's probably a story behind how the three of you kind of came together and really or what set you on this path to do this research and then collaborate together.
Yeah, I'll say, like, in terms of the research, as you heard in the intros, we all have different but also some overlapping areas. And I think it's a desire. This research specifically was born out of a desire to find projects where we could continue to work together. So trying to find those common grounds, the things that we all enjoyed. Charn and I, when we were at Northeastern, we had the ability to hire a lot of research assistants that could help us go through and mine a lot of this data that we used in the projects one of which we'll talk about primarily today. And so this gave us an opportunity to really put together an impressive data set and to dig in and answer some questions that we all found primarily interesting. So this is one of, I don't know, probably close to a dozen that have gone or are going on that we've all worked on together.
Good. Well, let me jump in right into this term that I dropped in the intro. Katie, I want to go to you on this one, okay? And I use the air quotes, workplace deviance. What exactly is that?
I mean, in terms of research, it's defined as anything that goes against the traditional norms or organizational norms that might harm your employees or your organization or both. But it's kind of diverse in terms of, like, how does that manifest? So that could be interpersonally, right? Someone gossiping about you or being rude directly to you. Or it could be someone acting out against the organization, right? Whether it's stealing the property from an organization or, engaging in some kind of time theft. But in general, it's kind of the things that we, consider are negative behaviors at the in a workplace, right? So anything that's counterproductive in nature.
Yeah. What about you, Parker? How would you define it?
Very similar. I'd say that anything that goes against the expectations of the organizational culture now could be defined as workplace deviance. And obviously, when you go back to sort of societal norms for behaving at work, it's are you behaving badly instead of behaving like a good citizen or good employee?
Yeah, right. Okay, so obviously, I don't want to have I don't want anybody with that kind of label, workplace deviance, working for me, because obviously there's going to be some effects on the people, on the work, and on the organization as a whole. Maybe even its mission, its whatever. So, I mean, how bad does it get if I have somebody like that in my organization? What are the effects on both people and teams and the company as a whole?
I think one thing about workplace deviance is when we define it and say it, it sounds awful, but I think it's also important to realize that probably everyone, probably most of us included, having engaged in some form of workplace deviance at some point or another, we've probably gossiped at one point in our lives, and there's a wide range of behaviors, from probably fairly innocuous gossiping to actually sabotaging your organization, right? So we should be clear that there's a wide range of behaviors, and we don't necessarily want to demonize this idea of workplace deviance, partially because, as we're going to talk about, leaders can engender that in individuals. So I just want to make that a little bit more clear that, yeah, some people are people we definitely don't want in our organization, but there's probably going to be a low level of workplace deviance that occurs, on a general basis.
Right. Okay. So would this be a good point to dive into that research? Because I don't want to get too far ahead and start calling leaders the responsible for bad apple behaviors or workplace deviance. But I mean, you dug into extensive stuff here. So what'd you guys find?
Yeah, I think the genesis of this is that this idea, and you kind of said in the introduction, which is individuals or we as organizations look at leaders and say, oh, we have these employees who are performing badly, and it's because they're bad apples, right? Like they are, I shouldn't say performing, but are behaving badly. And those are bad apples. And so therefore the leader can't be held responsible for their actions because they're just bad people. And I think we kind of looked at it and said, is that really the case? I mean, is that a fair assessment when in fact, there's a possibility that leaders' behavior, and the research is clear for quite some time, that things like abusive supervision can lead to negative outcomes. People reduce what we call citizenship behaviors, which is those like the coming in early and making the coffee or volunteering for extra, roles at work. That's being a good citizen. When you have abusive supervisors, destructive leaders, that reduces people's desire to engage in those behaviors. So it also makes sense that certain individuals are uninspired to the point where they might become deviant due to their leaders' behaviors. And I think that was kind of what we were looking at. Is that in fact true? And so we conducted what's called a meta-analysis. And like you mentioned earlier, over 60,000 observations. And those observations are people who were surveyed. So these are not just like random points of data. This is people who took surveys, and we looked over, years and years of research to draw our conclusions.
Yeah. Who else has anything to add about that, about the research itself?
I was going to say, so if you want to get a little more technical, and we've actually done some follow-up work to try to hone in on this question more specifically since the article that you mentioned that came across your desk came out. So one of the things that we've done more recently is try to pit bad leaders against the people themselves in predicting deviant behavior at work. And to oversimplify it, like if we're pitting the leaders, that's good. Or that's not good. That's easy. We look at destructive leadership, abusive supervision, put that in a model. And if we're going to try to put the people in, the best way that we think to approximate that is, well, let's look at their personality traits. So load things into the model alongside of destructive leadership, like openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. That's called the Big Five, which some people are probably familiar with. But then also throw in there sort of the dark side, which would be more prone to predict that type of bad behavior, which is the dark triad: Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. And I think the punchline of that is when you put all of that into the model, like, do bad apples exist? Absolutely, right? We can look and see that is not surprisingly elements of the dark triad, primarily Machiavellianism and psychopathy, will predict that bad behavior, the organizational deviance, interpersonal deviance at work. But you'd probably be surprised how much of that model is driven by destructive leadership.
So here's what I'm thinking, because a lot of listeners might be going, wait, you know what? They're bashing us over the head because I'm a leader. And so let me play devil's advocate. I've been in environments where there are bad apples and there are character issues at work. So how do you account for, people that they come in the organization, they may not even, they shouldn't even been hired because they just may not fit the values of the organization, but they're just bad people in general. So how do you account for that in the research where it may not be the leader? It may just be, hey, we inherited it. I'm a new leader. I just got promoted to management and I inherited a bunch of bad apples. So what would you say to that?
And I think Parker hit it on the head that, bad apples, of course, do exist. And I think this is what maybe makes academic research a little bit easier than putting the rubber to the road as a leader, because you need to be able to make that decision. Is this behavior of my employees due to the fact that they're bad apples, or am I contributing to it? Right. And so I would say what that leader has to do in this situation where they come in and they may have bad apples is, this research is not to vindicate the bad apples. It is, in fact, to tell leaders, you have to look inward and decide, is it me or is it my employees? And if it's your employees, you have to go through the normal methods of getting rid of them, I think. The last time I was on, we were talking about likable leaders, right? It's not saying that you have to be a friend as a leader, it's saying that maybe you should be a good person, right? And I think that's the dichotomy here with leaders is like, we can give you this information, say, hey, sometimes it's your fault. But as a leader, you have to know, no, this time it actually was my employees. But that requires a lot of introspection to make sure you're not just passing the blame off of yourself and assigning it to someone else.
That's interesting. So, okay, just so that leaders not aware that they're causing the workplace deviance. Let's say that I just haven't raised my self-awareness to know that I'm causing this kind of disruption in other people becoming these bad apples, right? You have one of the recommendations that I saw in the article is that you have to quote identify the flashpoint. What is it, and what does it look like in practice?
I think the flashpoint is the flashpoint in either the relationship, which I think that our article does a good job of capturing this idea of, did you have an argument, right? Were you overly harsh in delivering feedback? Or was it at an organizational level, right? So was there a policy change? And are your employees very upset? And are you, as the leader representing the organization, they're directing their deviant behaviors towards you versus the organization? And I think that those are things that we probably have all experienced, right? We had maybe conflict in the workplace with a boss, or we have felt some sort of unfairness or unjustness that happened to us at the organizational level, or maybe representation above our direct leader. And so I think that for leaders, the self-awareness of determining what that flashpoint is and maybe the shift in the relationship is really critical.
Okay. Who else?
So I think the other thing to think about in addition to the flashpoint is a lot of times you want to try to, as a leader, look at what they're doing, like who they're lashing out at, and trying to use that as information about what the source of that bad behavior is. So if they're stealing from the organization, well, they're mad at the organization, that can't be my fault as a leader. And I think what we're trying to challenge people to think about is, well, as a leader, you embody the organization, right? A lot of people look to you as sort of an exemplar of the organization. So if they're acting out in a way that's not necessarily directed at you as a person, as an individual, but they're acting out in a way that's against the organization, it might actually be because they're mad at you and they're acting out against the organization because they view you as the same thing. And in fact, we can separate deviance into, we've kind of hinted at it, but you can separate it into individual and organizational, and the relationship between destructive leadership and organizational deviance is actually stronger than the relationship between destructive leadership and individual deviance. So again, you can't let yourself off the hook because they're stealing staplers or whatever from or sabotaging the organization. Like, they may in fact be doing it because of how you're behaving and how you're leading.
Ooh, okay. So everything starts with raising the standard for how you lead. If you're going to put yourself in the role of a leader, you're really holding yourself accountable to how people are going to respond to your type of leadership or management. So that's again, it's speaking. We were talking offline a little bit about emotional intelligence and how you guys frame it, political skill. And I don't know if that's a segue to that topic or not, because I'm wondering if leaders even have the capacity to know what they're creating around them, so that if an employee becomes a bad apple and turns around and says, well, it's because of what my boss did 2 weeks ago, et cetera, does the boss have the self-awareness to know, oh, did I create that? Oh, I had no idea. They might just be thinking that. Because when I do assessments and I survey top layer of the organization and the workforce, there's such a disparity of perception level, right? The top layer thinks they're all that in the bag of chips, and the workforce is talking about all kinds of complaints and shortcomings, et cetera. So I don't know if that's a question of EQ or not, or how do we address that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great segue into both EQ and political skill. Mm-hmm. I would take a step back and say, when I teach leadership every semester here at NAU, and on the very first day of class, which I'm having on Tuesday of next week, all my students will be there for a leadership class. They're seniors. And probably on the first day of every class they've ever had, they say, this is a great topic. Economics is the most important thing you'll learn. And then finance is the most important thing you'll learn. On the first day of class, try to hit them with kind of a left hook and say, leadership is one of the most frustrating, miserable experiences you'll ever have. And I give them this whole thing about how leadership is lonely, leadership is painful. And of course, I bring it back around and say that's also why leadership is the best job you could possibly have, because it's about solving new problems every day. But it also means that leaders have to be that cut above in terms of having that self-awareness. And we talk about love in action, right? If you are going to be a servant leader, it's about taking the focus off of yourself and putting on others. And that gives you hopefully that room in a smaller ego to start thinking, could I have been the cause of this? And I think that's often one of the hardest parts of explaining this idea of deviance or abuse to practitioners from an academic standpoint, because from a practitioner standpoint, one of the weaknesses of something called abusive supervision, one of our forms of destructive leadership, is it's the employee's perceptions of your behavior. And leaders have a hard time swallowing that, because they could say, I wasn't abusive, but the way we define it is it's the employee's perception of that. And I can see why that irks leaders a little bit. One is I was in the military for about 10 years, and our general day-to-day behavior would probably have been considered somewhat abusive in a civilian organization. So I get that we have to calibrate. But that is what is so much fun about being a leader, is you have to be the one to understand, how do I develop these relationships with my individual employees to make sure they know that I have their best interests in mind, right? And so I do think that it's very possible for things like EQ, but also, as we were mentioning, political skill, to allow leaders to be what we would say is socially astute enough to hopefully see how their behaviors are affecting their leaders. And I'll throw that to Parker, hopefully with a good handoff on political skill being opened up.
Yeah, so political skill does consist of 4 different dimensions. We won't dig into all of them, but I think the one Charn highlighted, social astuteness, is the most important. And trying to understand, and going back to something Katie talked about with this idea of a flashpoint, is, are you socially aware enough of what is happening at work? What is the relationship between you and your employees? What is the relationship also between the employees themselves, right? That's something that probably doesn't get talked about enough, that if you're really politically skilled and if you're a really good leader, you should have that ability to be able to sort of see the matrix, as I like to say when I'm teaching this in sessions with students or executives, is if you can look through and understand why people are behaving the way they are, you can generate maybe a different picture of why things are playing out the way they are. I do want to say, it sounds like we've been bashing leaders a lot through this, and it's your fault. But I think it's also important to recognize that leaders are people, right? We're humans.
Right.
And one of the things that we know is about how we make attributions as humans is that when other people behave in a bad way, we often say that's on them, right? But if we mess up, we often look at ourselves and that's an external pressure, right? Something else caused me to do this. And I think one of the sort of fundamental messages we're trying to say here is get leaders to step back, almost recognize that humanity, and not just automatically say, well, this is a bad apple. Again, they might be. It's entirely possible that they are, but we're asking that you step back and look and say, okay, is it possible that I'm contributing to the bad behavior of my employees and among my employees, even if it's not impacting me directly, but that's clearly going to impact the organization.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. To me, it's stepping back, self-assessing, self-reflecting. What am I contributing to the problem? How am I contributing to this type of deviant behavior in others, is what I'm getting from this discussion. That begs the question, though. You mentioned, do we have the right skills to be more socially aware? How do we get those skills to be more socially and even situationally aware of what's going on?
From a political skill perspective, I think that's actually one of the $1 million questions that the research is trying to answer. We're pretty sure that political skill does increase over time, but it's going to take feedback. It's going to take some kind of mentorship. And I think that's one of the unique things about political skill that we somewhat hypothesize or theorize, is that you can have a person in an organization for 20 years, 25 years, And they may not actually grow in political skill because they haven't been introspective or they haven't had a leader, right? Actually, a mentor come and talk to them and say, hey, let's actually break down how this promotion process went down, or let's break down where this mistake happened in the organization. So I would say, one of the first ways to learn to be introspective is to get someone who is not you to give you feedback, right? Because it's hard for us to look inward and find out where our own flaws are. So instead, get that mentor, get that leader who you feel comfortable speaking with and sharing your thoughts, and let them tell you how other people viewed your actions and viewed your behaviors, and get that outside opinion, because it's a lot easier to be introspective when someone else is telling you what they saw as well. I think that'd be one good first step for leaders to consider.
Yeah.
I think I can speak to that as well, maybe just even within our team dynamic. I'm the youngest on the team. I was the last one to join. Very graciously, the team invited me into their writing group. And I see all of them as like very important mentors to me, both in terms of academic, but also professionally and personally. All three of these co-authors have really shaped my life as both an author and as a person. And I think so much of that is because of the mentorship that exists within our writing team. And it's that just like pure feedback. And it's never from a place of harshness, but always from a place of friendship. Of Katie, if you want to do this long term, these are the plays that need to happen, and these are the things that you need to develop within your career. And so I can't speak to that enough, the place of mentorship and how it can develop you as a leader, no matter your career choice.
I'll add one more thing. Thank you for that, Katie. But thinking back, before I went to academia, I had a career in industry as well, and I was blessed to have a lot of those same mentors. I think Charn had them as well, and that's probably why we try to act the way that we do with our students. But thinking back, like sort of the practical things that leaders can do, like yes, try to find that person, right, that can show you. Try to be that person to others. Someone mentioned recently in an article, controlling the meeting after the meeting, right? And I sort of taking that idea and using that as an opportunity not to sort of gossip and contribute to workplace deviance, but to break it down and understand. And, we would go on offsite meetings, and I remember riding back for hours in the car with one of my mentors. He's like, let's talk about what happened. Like, this is why this person probably said what they said. This is, this comment, there's a lot underlying that. And so it really is hard to develop social astuteness on your own. But if you have somebody, as Charn said, to walk through and think about what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on sort of under the surface of the water, right? We often just see the tip of the iceberg, but putting some of that into practice, and you'd be surprised at how often you can be sitting in a meeting then, weeks or months or years later, and one little comment, you're like, oh, I know there's more here, and I think I can connect some dots now and understand like why people are behaving the way they are. And that's going to translate, hopefully, again, getting back to the point of the topic today, is then when your employees are behaving badly, when they're engaging in organizational deviance and interpersonal deviance, you'll be able to look at it and say like, well, wait a minute, like it's probably not just about that one instance. There's much, much, much more under the surface that I need to think about, including what my role might be in that.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. Can I add one thing to that, Marcel? Yeah. So I think, we dived into political skill and we didn't really define it. And we talked about EQ before. And I think as we were talking in the pre-show, emotional intelligence, political skill kind of arose around the same time. One went a little more mainstream, and political skill kind of stayed somewhat in the academic realm. But so we look at political skill as basically your ability to navigate political environments. And every organization, as we know, is a political environment, right? If you think there's no politics going on in your organization, it's probably just going over your head, right? And so I would say that for leaders, in terms of, understanding the dynamics in the workplace and, identifying what maybe mistakes you made or understanding why your employees might be upset, part of that social astuteness, and I know we're not going to dive into all of the dimensions of political skill, but your ability to actually relate to your employees, to get to know them, to influence them well, all those things are wrapped up in political skill. And I think that's how, as leaders, we can definitely succeed in understanding what our actions or what outcomes our actions may be causing by building relationships, strong relationships with our employees that are both professional but beneficial in the sense that we know what they want from us. And we know how to inspire them best on an individual level. Like I tell my students, we don't lead groups of people, we lead individuals organized as groups. And there's a big difference there, right? I'm not looking at just monolithic group of people. Each one of my employees is an individual person. I need to motivate them differently than the next.
Mm. Okay, you may have hinted at the answer to this question, but I was going to ask you guys to make the link between the research to what's going on in today's society and current events and with industry trends. I mean, we're in the middle of we're now steeped into AI. People are afraid. There is political polarization unlike any other times that I can remember. So why is this research important in terms of all those things, or any other thing that you might come up with?
I think that's a complex question. There's a lot of angles there. I'm gonna chop off just one little bit and maybe save AI for one of the other two. But Gallup recently did a study and showed that employees, what they really want is a coach, not a boss, was sort of the takeaway. And I talk about this a lot with my students and the sessions I do on leadership. I'm like, what does that mean, right? And they're like, well, they want somebody that's invested in them. They want somebody that's invested in their development, right? They don't want somebody that's just barking orders. Now, I know we can get into, well, they're different coaches, right? We've got Bobby Knight, maybe at one end of the spectrum, and
throwing the chair,
right? And Tony Dungy at the other end of the spectrum. So there is some nuance within it as well. But I think the underlying message there is they want someone that is coming alongside, is committed to their development, is trying to help them grow, not just the organization grow, that they feel like they're invested. So it's alluding, sort of building off of what Charn said about not just looking at this team or this group as an entity, but looking at the individuals that are on there and how are you going to help me, you as a leader, help me as your employee get better. And a lot of that is sort of understanding that that's a relationship, and there's two people in that relationship, right? And the leader is at least one half of that, right? Depending upon what we're talking about. So again, like you have a role in the way that your employees, as individuals and as a group and as an organization, are performing, are behaving, are feeling even.
I think maybe I can not the AI part. I might pitch that to Charn. I mean, I certainly have a lot of thoughts about AI. I think that the kind of media that will come out over the next, decade, as it relates to like literature and then films, will be based in AI and our fear of like being controlled. But I also think there's like this underlying fear of like corporate greed that a lot of people from Gen Z through millennials also feel. This is something I've talked a lot about with my sister. My sister was an English major and studied narrative theory pretty extensively. And we talked about the difference between like some pretty major generational differences of like how we saw superheroes. So in many ways, Gen Z and millennials were not raised on like the classic superhero story. We were raised on Avengers. And Avengers Assemble. And so I think that many people want to be heard in their workplace, and engagement is very much that coach mindset that Parker is speaking to, that they want to be heard and acknowledge when they're wrong, right? I mean, that's just part of growth. But then they also want to assemble teams. Like they want to feel as if they're part of something in a really meaningful way. And I think that we can see that happening in social media, whether it's something you engage with or not. Modern social media is about collaborative storytelling. I mean, stitching between videos is about telling stories together. It's that campfire experience that we don't have in real life anymore, but we're having on our phones in the morning. And so I think that this is a generation or a time of transition in the workplace, that if we can come at it from a collaborative standpoint, we'll have a lot of success.
It's profound.
Yeah, I totally agree with both Katie and Parker here on the generational difference. There's a great speech from the 60s long ago given by Edith Sampson called "Choose One of Five." And in that speech, she says it's all graduates' responsibility to relentlessly reject all stereotypes. And I think when we think about stereotypes, we often think in terms of the traditionally bad stereotypes, maybe race, whatever it may be. But I think what we're seeing with the generational divide is that is becoming a stereotype in and of itself. And I hear that from leaders, I hear it from colleagues, particularly about Generation Z, because they are the de rigueur of like the workplace right now. But growing up as like right on the cusp of that millennial Gen X, born in 1983, millennials were highlighted as the downfall of everything for quite some time. Even when I was in the military, there was quite a bit of consternation about, millennial officers, whatever it may be. That experience kind of gave me insight into the way that we treat Gen Z and the way that leaders walk into an office expecting Gen Z to act that day. And I think if we really take this advice from 70 years ago or 60 years ago, the relentless rejection of all stereotypes includes not applying what I think Gen Z is going to be like when they walk into my office on the first day. And so I think that's one of the first things that we should be thinking about. And so as a leader, and this is to go back to what Parker said, he talked about, it's not just about being a leader anymore. People want coaches, right? They want mentors. They want people who are going to help them achieve success, not direct them to achieve success. And this is not, again, we're going to take a step away from the research and talk more practically, but where destructive leadership usually thinks about these really bad behaviors, I would argue in a way that what also could contribute to this type of behavior is just not caring about your employees. And coaches care about their players. Leaders who are coaches care about their employees, right? And when we think about the onset of AI, what I see leaders talking about is, AI is going to mean I don't have to do this boring part of my job. Or instead of writing a birthday note, I'm going to tell AI to generate all my birthday notes for this year, right? I think those are the little things that make you a coach. It's when you actually take the time to give that individual effort. And so what I worry about is leaders who want to start farming out that individual effort to AI, right? And not actually sitting down and writing that thank you note by hand and putting that little personal touch that AI doesn't know, right? Hey, it was really great what you did this week, or I really hope your kids are having a great soccer season. That's where I think AI takes it away from the person. Again, it's not necessarily being abusive as a leader, but it's not caring. And I think that's the next step of this research is let's just all agree to not be abusive leaders, right? That's a pretty easy and low bar to set. The high bar that we need to get to is, can we continue to care about our leaders or care about our employees as leaders and not farm out those personal tasks to AI? And I think that's where we should be looking at going.
I love it. That's great. Good way to segue into sort of our ending questions. Okay, but I wanted to really boil down this research. So let's take turns here. What would you say to the person that's still not quite sure, how to interpret everything we talked about? What would you say is your big aha about this research?
I think for me, if we went into the research, we would show that there are some pretty meaningful bad apple indicators that didn't really come up in our conversation. Things like low conscientiousness and low agreeableness that contribute to deviance. But I think ultimately our research shows that just because those personality differences may be a part of the bad apple narrative, that being an abusive leader is maybe not a more meaningful, but just as meaningful contributor to deviant behavior. And so abusive supervision, destructive leadership, if these are things that your employees perceive you to be, that's something you have to work on as a leader, right? Even if you don't believe you don't believe that's something you're enacting, the perception of it by your employees is meaningful and can have really, really significant impact on your workplace.
Yeah.
Parker, you might have some other thoughts.
That's good.
Yeah, I'd say to build on that, thinking about again, going back to this notion, the bad apples certainly exist, right? And even I think we're oversimplifying to say you're either a bad apple or a good apple, right? But there are people that have these tendencies, right? That may behave in bad ways more often than others. And I think it's not necessarily an either or, which is what honestly most of this leadership this research was trying to look at is it leadership? Is it the person? But there's probably an interaction going on there. And if you think about, you've got somebody that is more prone to behave in these deviant manners, and you have a tendency maybe to not always behave as the best leader, that might actually make it worse. You may be the one that's bringing out the worst in them rather than the best in them. And so again, challenge you to sort of flip that as a leader and think about what your role is. And are they appearing like a bad apple because I'm highlighting that aspect of them in the way that I lead.
Parker, that's good.
Yeah,
And I'm going right back to again, and I encourage my listeners listening to, if you're in a leadership role, you need to step back and ask yourself, how am I contributing to these bad apples becoming bad apples? They may not have been bad apples before they walked in the door until they were under your leadership, and now they're disgruntled. They're unhappy. They're disengaged. Well, why is that? So let's look at ourselves first as leaders. Charn, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that was great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's essentially what you guys just said with this. The normal excuse that we say is, well, there's a bad apple. And what hopefully did with this research, we kind of rip that off as a first response and say, as opposed to saying as a leader, hey, there's no way I could have caused it, it's just a bad person. We're moving it from an excuse to back into the pile of what are some things that I may have done. They may still be a bad apple. You can still decide this person is a bad apple and they shouldn't be in my organization anymore. But hopefully we're not giving you that shorthand of I'm off the hook. They're a bad apple. And I think if we boil it down, that's just what it comes down to. We're ripping off that Band-Aid of saying, well, they're a bad apple. I can't be responsible for their behavior. And I think that's a pretty powerful tool for leaders to be able to take an extra second and say, yeah, maybe I did contribute.
Excellent. All right, gang, we bring it home with two questions as we do with every guest. And the first one is the love question. I got to say it more manly. The love question, because this is a manly show. I do my push-ups right before I get on. So, all right. So how do I lead with more practical, actionable love? Love, the verb, right? It's got to be backed with action, but we call it love because we see what the research has been telling us now is that leadership is about love. We have to be able to practice that kind of style of leadership to be effective. Okay. So how do we do it day in and day out? I'll start with Katie. Ladies first.
I think this is a big question. I mean, I personally think that love is about something that's unconditional. And so I think, unfortunately, I mean, workplaces have conditions and there are boundaries that have to be set. And so I think it's how do you bring your most unconditional love self to work with the understanding that the context exists. But then I think about for my own leadership and something that has like brought me a lot of peace and usefulness, both in the classroom leading students, but also in my work, is some sort of grounding practice, right? Like whatever you do, whatever 3 deep breaths you take before speaking or before starting a meeting or before starting your day, I think whether that's based in some type of spiritual background or not, like I think that being able to calm your nervous system before talking to a difficult employee or even an employee you get along with, I think can make for a much better leadership experience. And I think that those are practices that can be used by anyone in any setting. So just a few thoughts.
I love it. I love it. Practice a little more mindfulness.
Yeah.
Good. Parker.
I think, and I'll try to go with the theme that we said about sort of stepping back as a leader and what's coming out of this research as well. And my wife is also an academic, so we get to share a lot of the same frustrations at work. We're in the same department right down the hall from each other right now. So we'll often say like, I can't believe this person did this, or I'm really frustrated by that. And we've started trying to make like our actionable practice in that way. So let's say they're engaging in organizational deviance that we've sort of observed is to start from a default of extending them grace, right? And so we don't understand in that moment what's going on, right? We don't know what kind of day they're having. Oftentimes we don't know what's going on outside of the workplace. We don't understand the full picture, right? We've just seen a snapshot at that one moment in time. And so she and I have started trying to encourage each other to step back, right, as we've been talking about. But the way that looks like for us is let's extend them a little grace. Let's not default to this is a character flaw or a condition of them, or like they're not a good colleague, coworker, student, whatever it may be, neighbor, and instead say like, well, let's think about why that person behaved that way, and let's give them a little grace, and that it may be not necessarily me or us, something that we did, but there may be more to the story here.
What I love about that, before I go to Charn, is building self-awareness again, to step back instead of react. You step back and try to understand what's going on around you, right? And then respond appropriately. I love it. I love it. Charn.
And I think the whole idea of your podcast is spot on, right? I mean, I think this idea of we lead with love, we lead as servants, we're going to be better leaders, and that's great. But also, we're going to have better organizations. We're going to have healthier, happier people working for us who probably want to stay. I mean, we look at retention rates now, and there's a reason they're so low. And in my opinion, a lot of it comes down to bad leadership and a lack of reciprocity from organizations. People are often willing to give a lot of themselves, but organizations not return. But to kind of circle back around to what Parker said, and a story I have from my time in the military, we had been deployed for 15 months to Iraq. So it was a very long deployment. It was early on in the conflict. And one of my pilots, and pilots are sometimes known for not being the most, not having the best haircut. You know, they kind of want to look like, I guess, Tom Cruise and Top Gun, even though we were in the Army. And one of my pilots didn't have a great haircut, was sitting at a chair at an office, and some guy came up and said, "Hey, great haircut." And it was clear he didn't have a good haircut, but he was like, "Hey, thanks. The barbershop's right down the street." That first passive aggressive comment was by a 3-star general who wasn't wearing his uniform at the time. And my pilot, I was his commander at the time, also gave, I guess, what was probably a passive aggressive comment, whether intentionally or not. What I found about 3 hours later, when I was standing on the carpet of a full bird colonel, my brigade commander, with my battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, with my sergeant major, and with this pilot, was this kid. I mean, he was a kid. I mean, we were all very young, but he was particularly young. We just gotten back from a 15-month deployment. His haircut wasn't the first thing on his mind. He just wanted to, have this life. And what I recognized, I can remember standing there and listening to my brigade commander, listening to my battalion commander. I don't think anyone really fully understood what this kid had just gone through, what we'd all gone through, and that this haircut, haircut. At the same time, we needed to extend a little grace, to use Parker's phrase there, your phrase there, Marcel. And so when we got back to my headquarters building, and I had a conversation with him, there was no ill intent meant. There was no malice in his passive aggressive reply. I don't think he even really meant to be passive aggressive. He was just giving a response, wasn't even focusing on this person. Didn't know he was a general, just thought he was some random person. And that's a long story to say that let's take a second to listen to people and listen to our employees and recognize why something might be happening. And these small affronts, sometimes we attribute major things. Oh, they're a bad person, right? They don't want to help with this organization. They don't want to help with this. Or maybe what we think is a slightly aggressive comment, a passive aggressive comment. It might not be anything, right? That's a leader's job to figure out, but giving some grace, listening, and recognizing that people have been going through a lot of things, especially, I mean, we use COVID all the time now, but it was a while ago. But some of those things still linger. And if COVID was one thing, you have no idea what that person was going through in their life this last year or two. Give them a little bit of grace. And if you're a great leader, you should know what's going on in their life. You should have that conversation with before this happens. And you might be able to say, hey, I know that, John is going through this. Maybe that's a reason. And that doesn't mean we can't correct the behavior, but it also means we'll have the ability to give them grace as a leader because we spent that time up front getting to know them.
Fantastic answers, all of you. Okay, we finally close us out with that. You close us out with that one thing, that one key takeaway for us to walk away with. What would that be? And Parker, I'll start with you this time.
I'd say, as a leader, like, we have high expectations, right? And we can have outsized influence on certainly people's careers, but also their lives, right? And so one big thing for me of this is think about your role, right? Think about how you're impacting this situation, how you're impacting that person, right? Don't focus it on them and what they're doing as much, but think about your role in that interaction.
Katie?
I think that the last round of questions really spoke to this idea of giving people grace and allowing for grace, but also, a massive amount of self-reflection associated with that. So to me, I think self-reflection and the importance of it in those interactions is so key.
Then last, I'd say develop relationships with your subordinates, right? Again, it's not that you're leading a group of people, you're leading a group of people or a group of individuals organized as a group. And if you actually get to know everyone you're working with, you're going to better understand what are their concerns, what are their successes. You'll be able to celebrate those successes and maybe help them talk through some of those problems they've been having. And that's what a coach does. We're no longer just saying, hey, go here, make X widgets, and then go home. People are looking for guidance. They're looking for that coach who will mentor them, hopefully to the next level. I always think the best mark of a leader is someone who's not afraid to train and mentor their people to the point where they can leave if they wanted to, right? That shows someone who's confident in themselves. And I think if we develop those relationships, we'll be in a better place to be that kind of leader.
Mm. Yeah, I see the theme here of relationships, even like extending grace to others as being more forgiving, less judgmental, less critical. Because sometimes, I mean, these days, we have negative scripts running through our heads because of whatever that is, whether it's the narrative that we follow, because of what the media is feeding us. But yeah, we tend to be less tolerant, less accepting of others. And so everything you folks have spoken to brings us back to authentic relationships and connections. And I so appreciate that. Lines up totally with the theme of the podcast. All right. So if people want to connect with you, where can they go? Do you have a website or send them somewhere? So I'll start with Katie. Where can people find you?
Sure, they can find me on LinkedIn, and then I'll also share my Loyola bio and CV address if someone wants to connect with me, whether it be for personally or professionally.
Perfect. Parker?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can probably find me on there. Shoot me an email. I don't know if you want to put in the notes. I can say it here, p.ellen@msstate.edu, and love to chat with leaders in all kinds of different organizations.
Awesome. Charn.
Yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn, probably the easiest to find because my mom named me Charn. So there's not many that are going to pop up if you type my name in. So Charn McAllister on LinkedIn, or like Parker, charn.mcallister@nau.edu. And yeah, I'm always happy to chat with leaders. That's a big part of what we do.
Fantastic. It's been rich. It's been meaningful. And this conversation is over for this podcast, but hey, it's not over if you subscribe to my Substack, and I'm going to invite you right now to head on over. And the link is going to be in the show notes, and I'm going to ask Charn, Katie, and Parker some questions. And here's what I'm thinking, gang, because this actually came up right in the middle of our discussion. Political skill. Okay. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence and maybe even elevate the conversation to political skill and how to be more skillful in those areas. And we're going to do that in the green room over at Substack. So click on the link, head on over there, and we will see you soon. Ciao, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Love in Action podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, subscribe, and leave us a review. Until next time, don't forget, the future of leadership is love in action. Believe it, practice it, and watch your leadership and business flourish.